Evidence for the Kushites. 6. One way to test the theory is to examine why people have rejected it in the past. Who knows? Perhaps the reason does contain truths that deal the theory a fatal blow. To see why modern scholarship in the main has been so skeptical of the Kushites' military performance, let's go back to the father of Egyptology, James Henry Breasted, 1865 to 1935. Although not the originator of the notion that the Napatans were duds in Judah, he embraces the view, and long after his death, he remains one of its most influential advocates. Several aspects of the Illinois native's career command admiration: the depth of his erudition, as seen in his translation of innumerable hieroglyphic texts, his daring-do fieldwork in Egypt and Sudan, his organizing with financial aid from John D. Rockefeller of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institution in 1919 as a hotbed of archaeological research, and his ability as a popularizing scholar of the highest order to communicate his admiration of ancient Egypt to a wide audience. All these things make Breasted one of the 20th century's leading historians in any field. The main vehicle for Breasted's enduring influence today is his book, A History of Egypt. Ever since its publication in 1905, this thick volume has served as a standard primer for new generations of Egyptologists. It has been hailed as a masterpiece and probably the best general history of pharaonic Egypt ever published. Although after a century, some of the contents have inevitably become dated, today's scholars frequently still cite many of the book's core conclusions with confidence. The Yale-trained scholar devotes an entire chapter of A History of Egypt to the Kushite dynasty. Quick excerpts will show his attitude. When looking for a strong ruler to defend against Assyria, ordinary Egyptians looked in vain during the supremacy of the inglorious Ethiopians. In 701 BC, Sennacherib's army deposed of Taharqa without difficulty. The reason Sennacherib withdrew, explains the book with impressive-sounding detail, was that plague-infested winds from the malarial shores of the eastern delta had scattered death among his troops. In describing how the 25th dynasty subsequently persisted in trying to foment trouble, the book asserts the Syro-Palestinian princes were so thoroughly cowed by Assyria that the inglorious Ethiopians were thenceforth unable to seduce them to rebellion. When, decades later, the Assyrian invaders closed in on Thebes, Taharqa ingloriously withdrew southward, seeking ignoble security on the upper Nile. During the Kushite period, Egypt was nothing less than a decrepit nation, in quotes. Indeed, by its failure to repel the Assyrians, the 25th dynasty demonstrated that there was never a line of kings so ill-suited to their high destiny. Under Taharqa's successor, Tanwentamani, the dynasty never had a chance. His whole career was characteristic of the feeble and inglorious line from which he sprang. During the 8th-page stretch, Breasted employs the word inglorious to describe the dynasty a total of 4 times. On what evidence does this renowned scholar base his view that the disease blown from the eastern delta caused Sennacherib's departure? He cites none. On what evidence does he conclude so insistently that the 25th dynasty was such a pitiful failure? In support of his hostile view of the Kushite pharaohs, Breasted cites one source. The source is the verse in 2 Kings 18 to 28, chapter 18, verse 21, where the Assyrian king's envoy, the Rabshakeh, tells the Jerusalem's beleaguered populace, "Now, behold, thou trustest upon the staff of this bruised reed, and even upon Egypt, whereon if a man lean it, will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, unto all that trust him." Breasted uses this King James translation. The Rabshakeh, Breasted proclaims, spoke the truth. The second expert who helped shape today's common view of the 25th dynasty is William Adams. Published in 1977, his landmark work, Nubia, A Corridor to Africa, remains the most comprehensive book to date on the history of the Upper Nile. Where does the University of Kentucky scholar who endorses the epidemic theory get his view of Cush's military failure in 701? Significantly, it is precisely the same place as Breasted, to whom he shows the indebtedness in endnotes after opening his chapter on the 25th dynasty by also solemnly quoting the Rabshakeh's weakened statement, Adam's comments. The Rabshakeh's weak read statement, Adam's comments. These words aptly suggest that the state to which Egypt's imperial fortunes had fallen in the 8th century BC, the passage, despite its mocking tone, is dear to the hearts of historians of Nubia, for it recalls the one brief appearance of Cush upon the stage of world history. The stamp of approval that rested in Adams award the Rabshakeh's speech is typical of modern scholarship. Thus, for example, Nicholas Grimmel, in his recent book, A History of Ancient Egypt, is as categorical as Breasted and Adams in accepting the Assyrian scornful characterization of Cushite Egypt as a bruised reed, or according to some translations, a broken reed. The Egyptology professor at the Sorbonne says, the Rabshakeh painted a portrait of the strength of Hezekiah's Egyptian ally, which, though unflattering, was undeniably close to the truth. In the 1991 edition of the Cambridge Ancient History, T.G.H. James, who invokes the Reed passage in order to reach his conclusion about the dynasty's abortive campaign of 701, the well-known British Museum Egyptologist makes this severe assessment of Kushite pharaohs. Their adventures into foreign affairs, almost invariably disastrous, were, it seems, not prompted by any consistent policy, but by misguided interest in the machinations of Palestinian and Syrian states, compounded with the misjudgment of the competence of their armies in opposition to the well-organized might of Assyria. In a 1995 article, Kenneth Kitchen, one of the most impressive, painstaking researchers I've come across, likewise cites the Rabshakeh speech in asserting that the Kushite performance in Kor was incompetent. Of the many other scholars who scoff at the dynasty's ability, not all explicitly invoke the broken reed statement, but they do not have to. The reputation of the dynasty as a politically and militarily hapless is so firmly entrenched that it no longer requires substantiation. My reading of many scholars' texts dealing to a greater or lesser extent with the events of 701 leads to this conclusion, that the Rabshakeh statement is the keystone upon which the case for Kushite's futility depends. Without this single jeering statement, in other words, the argument of the unreliability of Taharqa's army loses its best evidence. The argument simply falls apart. How are these scholars interpreting the broken reed passage? To see, we must not only look at the verse containing the statement, but also which the scholars do not do. The verses that come after it. The biblical writers have almost certainly theologically reshaped the Rabshakeh's original message because it is easy to follow. Let us use a translation of the New International Version. Speaking to Hezekiah's officials within earshot of the Jerusalemites crowding the city walls, the Rabshakeh declares, "Tell Isaiah, this is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. On what you are basing this confidence of yours? You say you have the strategy and military strength, but you speak only empty words. On whom are you depending that you rebel against me? Look now, you are depending on Egypt, the splintered reed of a staff, which pierces a man's hand and wounds him if he leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to all who would depend on him. And if you say to me, we are depending on the Lord our God, isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar in Jerusalem? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it." Notice the parallel construction which I have italicized and which is also apparent in other translations. The text point is that Hezekiah is depending on Egypt just as he is depending on Yahweh. Yes, the Assyrian is ridiculing the Judaic king's trust in Egypt, but he is also questioning his trust in Yahweh. It would be hard to shrug off this literary construction as unintentional. The Second King's narrative employs parallel construction elsewhere. As we see in chapter 4, it uses an extensive variation of the literary device in order to contrast the religious practices of the kings of Israel and those of Hezekiah. There should be no question that the biblical writers were sophisticated enough to use such a construction for a specific purpose and not by mere happenstance. Here, the biblical writers used the story of Jerusalem's salvation to demonstrate the mighty Assyrian king was wrong to question the soundness of Hezekiah's faith in Yahweh. Simultaneously, they used the city's rescue to show that the Assyrian king was equally wrong to question Hezekiah's dependence on Egypt. Far from impugning Egypt's reliability, the story fully vindicates Judah's dependence upon the country. The pithy part of the Chpt speech that has been cited also contains another striking element: ecclesiastical politics. The passage presents Hezekiah as a king who removed Yahweh's temples from elsewhere in Judah and commanded his subjects to worship exclusively at Jerusalem. Whenever the centralization of the religion actually took place, whether it was during the Hezekiah's reign or some scholars suggest several generations later, it is certain to have been controversial. Priests from outside the capital would have lost their franchises and perhaps told the population that an angry deity would bring down misfortune. The passage aims to legitimize this centralization. It introduces the issue by having the Chpt express skepticism about making Jerusalem the exclusive place of worship. As one prominent British translator of the biblical text, Israel W. Slotky, has noted of the envoy's remark, the argument runs thus: how can you expect help from your God in the face of Hezekiah's abolition of all his local places of worship in favor of a single altar in Jerusalem? The city's eventual rescue thus serves to refute skepticism and to confirm the theological correctness of the ecclesiastical reorganization. All scholars agree on that, yet the analogous logic of extending the argument to Egypt's reliability eludes them. The outcome of the overall narrative demonstrates that Yahweh's people can depend upon him. Yahweh supports the Davidic dynasty unconditionally. Hezekiah was right to centralize worship at Jerusalem for it's Yahweh's favorite city. Judah was right to rely on Egypt for help. The first three conclusions are self-evident. Today, the final one is not, because Breasted and the others take out of context the verse that speaks of Hezekiah's misguided reliance on Egypt. Given the symmetry with which the very next verse speaks of Hezekiah's misguided reliance on Yahweh, the passage implicitly anticipates the Pharaonic army's success. Indeed, this parallelism has an echo effect. Just after the passage cited above, the Chpt urges Hezekiah to make a wager with Sennacherib. If Hezekiah can find riders, Sennacherib will give him 2,000 horses for battle. Cockily, the envoy boasts that Assyria's charioteers and cavalrymen are invulnerable. He says, how can you repulse one officer of the least of my master's officials, even though you are depending on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Furthermore, I have come to attack and destroy this place without word from the Lord. Here the parallel is different. No longer does the Assyrian equate the folly of Hezekiah's trust in Cushite Egypt with that of his trust for Yahweh. The envoy claims that Assyria, not Hezekiah, and his people possess Yahweh's favor. The Chpt says that because Assyria serves as an instrument of Yahweh's will, the empire's adversary will fail to drive away even a single member of Assyria's forces. The final outcome, of course, will show that the reverse to be true. Yahweh will be loyal to Jerusalem, and it is Assyria's forces that will be set back. And who will set them back? The passage's logic would suggest that the chariots and horsemen of Egypt would be responsible. It is the 25th dynasty, not Assyria, that will serve as the instrument of divine will. The irony is rich. The very evidence that the scholarly establishment gives for doubting Cushite abilities turns out, when examined more thoroughly, to be ammunition that clinches the case for the Cushites. The key passage presents the Chpt as hostile to three things: Hezekiah's dependence on the Pharaoh, Hezekiah's dependence on Yahweh, and Hezekiah's exaltation of Jerusalem. Critics cannot choose which of these hostilities are justified and which are not. According to the passage's internal logic, the three are joined and indivisible. If critics still insist on dismissing the importance of the 25th dynasty in saving Jerusalem, fine, but they might usefully submit their own theory to this test, show that the point of Sennacherib oh, showed that the point of the Second King's deliverance story is that Yahweh is undependable. That same Yahweh whom the entire Hebrew Bible presents as invincible and omnipotent. And then they would have to show that the Bible never intended to depict Jerusalem as the holy city, unless the critics can demonstrate that. It seems clear that in relying so heavily on the broken reed passage as a source of their premise, they have themselves leaned on specious evidence. The reed has indeed snapped, and is doing so, puncturing their premise. Here, to recapitulate, as the chief reason for crediting the Cushite Egyptian army as the key agent in the rescue of Jerusalem, first, the consensus view that the biblical account of the deliverance was put together in distinct layers indicates that those layers are separated, and that this advancing army prompted the invaders' retreat. Second, in the centuries following the rescue, both Herodotus and biblical oracles present the Assyrians as fleeing under conditions of duress, pursued by an armed foe. The only adversary is in the theater of war capable of causing such distress was the Cushite Egyptian expedition. Third, in the years immediately after Assyria's withdrawal, Egypt under the Cushite pharaoh enjoyed extraordinary political and commercial influence in Judah and elsewhere in Kor, influence that is consistent with having emerged from the conflict with the upper hand. Fourth, a variety of texts, Assyrian, Judite, and Greek, showed that in this period, Cushite Egypt also possessed a reputation for exceptional military prowess, which is consistent with having forced Assyria's departure. And finally, in addition to the implicit message of 2 Kings' broken reed passage, the Hebrew Bible in several places accords Cush great honor. No nation receives such special treatment. No explanation presents itself other than the Cushite dynasty's help to Judah against Assyria.